My name is Ian Mitchell. I'm on the board of directors of the Ketamine Assisted Therapy Association of Canada, and I'm an emergency medicine physician in Kamloops, British Columbia. I've provided care for countless patients who've been brought to the emergency department with crippling depression and thoughts of suicide. It is the mandate of physicians, practitioners, and other professionals to support and protect these people. Unfortunately, the treatments and medications currently available are insufficient, something that those delivering care on the front lines all struggle with. Ketamine has an amazing safety profile and is considered an essential medication by the World Health Organization. I've been using it to help emergency patients for 25 years, but under current physician regulations, when it comes to providing ketamine for mental health indications, I'm unable to provide it. At CATA Canada, we recognize the need for more effective treatments and are providing information and advocacy to make ketamine-assisted therapy readily available to every Canadian who needs it.
And I'm founding board member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. And I'm really excited to invite you to our event coming up on June 30th. It's a live music concert / fundraiser for the Amazon called Frequencies for the Amazon. We're gonna have some amazing musical guests like East Forest and Yema and Murikal and some other friends of ours. And we're also gonna have a Shipibo Kinibo elder called Manuela Ahua Hawanari, who's a medicine woman, and her entire family really is like inside the healing and medicine space and doing really great work down in Peru. And so she's gonna come and sing us in Icaro, which is a huge blessing for us in the community. And all the funds that we're gonna raise from the event are gonna be given back to her community to amplify her work and to support her family and her community as well. And we're also going to be buying up some land in the rainforest through the Rainforest Trust and protecting it forever, because that's really important. So in sacred reciprocity, all the money is going back to those causes. Some people in the community are going to be donation matching as well. And so come on over, have some fun, donate a few bucks if you can, spread the event around, and let's do some good in the world. And I hope to see you there. Take good care and enjoy the World Psychedelics Day.
Welcome to the first annual World Psychedelic Day. My name is Kim Haxton. I'm on the board of the World Psychedelic Day, and I have 21 years experience of ceremonial plant use. I'm pleased to be your host on this discussion today. Today we'll be talking about Indigenous plant wisdom and Indigenous sovereignty. Jasmine was raised on the Lake of Woods, is of Norway House Cree Nation. She focuses on boreal forest ethnobotany, archaeology, and cultural anthropology. She also studies Amazonian medicine taught by Maestro Juan Flores of the, I'm sorry, Jasmine, you're gonna have to say their name.
It's Mayan Tuyaku.
Thank you. In Peru, Jasmine shares plant medicine teachings working throughout Northern Ontario and Canada. She is a board member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. Wade Davis is a writer, photographer, and filmmaker whose work has taken him from the Amazon to Tibet, Africa to Australia, Polynesia, to the Arctic. Explorer in residence of the National Geographic Society from 2000 to 2013. He is currently professor of anthropology and the BC Leadership Chair in Cultural Ecosystems at Risk at the University of British Columbia. He's also a distinguished author of 22 books. Trevor Mack is an award-winning Chilcotin filmmaker, writer, and photographer. He's been supporting plant ceremonial practices for a number of years, and he recently joined the Canadian Psychedelic Association Indigenous Advisory Board. That's a tongue twister. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming here. And so, Trevor, I'm going to invite your voice in first to talk about Indigenous sovereignty as it means to you, what it means to you.
Well, where I come from, Tlerenco is a community in the Tlaixcotean Nation. And so Tlaixcotean comes from a word, Tlaixcos. And so that word, Tsai, means rock, Chlut is glacier, Kos is mixing in the water. And so this is a literal place. It's a literal place that exists and that you can go to. It's a spatial concept of an identity. And so Tlaixcotean means people of the glacial rock rivers. And so I think when we talk about Indigenous sovereignty in relation to plant medicine, I think we're talking about all of the aspects of the inherent rights to protect all of the nodes of connection that make all of these connections happen for that identity, for that spatial identity to exist, for this phenomenon to take place, because an entire identity of people, Tailkotin people, coming from the word Tailkos, all it that exists because of this specific literal place that this phenomenon is happening, where the glacier streams come and meet our sacred lake, Tailko B, where we have 5 streams that meet our lake. And these are the actual places that we're named after. And so this doesn't happen unless all of these other nodes and all of these other phenomenons are working and they're connected. And so I think sovereignty over that means being able to protect, being able to manage, and being able to harvest, gather medicines from the areas in which are all connected into the identity that an Indigenous people comes from. And whether it's psychoactive plants or non-psychoactive plants, they're all plants or medicines. And so psychoactive plants, you know, they have a bit faster and more tangible effects than some other plants. You know, some other plants may take years of usage to have certain effects. So all of the plants are all medicines. And so I think Indigenous sovereignty comes from the inherent right to protect everything that makes a spatial identity possible.
Jasmine, thank you. I was wondering if you could speak to that, because your work is a little bit different as a ethnobotanist and cultural anthropologist and Indigenous woman.
Yeah, and you know what? It's so amazing to listen to Trevor. This is the first time I got to hear where you were from, Trevor. So that was absolutely lovely, because my story is very similar, but I'm Mushkigo, so I come from the place where there's many swamps, like in the peat bog kind of area, and on Lake of the Woods there's a lot of fens, and that's where I collect most of my medicine, are in these freshwater fens, and not just medicine but food as well. So the Mushkigo, like the muskeg, is my identity, and it's a big part of it because the moose traverse the area, the caribou go through the muskeg, and it's a very large area in northern Ontario, where we need to protect that, because like Trevor had said, that it is part of my identity as a person of the land, is that my relationship, my food, all of the medicines, psychoactive and non-psychoactive, the boreal forest, there's multiple plants that I feel like I need to be able to continue every single day, that I use daily. So wholeheartedly, my identity is the muskeg, and the muskeg is one large being. That's the way I feel about it when I'm working with my plants and the animals, is that it's this being that it wants to consume me, but that's its job, is to take in, consume, and then it has a, peat bogs don't degrade very, like there's isn't organic matter that degrades very well, because it's an airless environment. So many things get preserved in the bog as well, and they could be up to 30 feet deep. And so when, like in my area, when they start to mine or they start to collect peat moss for people for gardening, which is excellent because there's a lot of funguses that can help plants to grow, fix nitrogen and everything. Like, I understand why people did that. My grandfather did that in a very small scale, but these large scales are robbing me of my identity, that how I have identified with the waters and the plants and the muskegs, everything. Many of those, psychoactive and non-psychoactive, I consider many of the plants psychoactive, regardless, like they do have a specific effect But like Trevor said as well, is that it requires years of usage and years of understanding to be able to gather a lot of that. So I am, like Trevor's, the rocks and the water and the glaciers. I am I am the muskeg. So I come from a different area, but I have a very similar value about why it's so important to protect these areas.
Beautiful, thank you. Wade, it's a little bit of a different, same question, but as a person who's been had the privilege to be able to travel around the world and as an incredible ally for Indigenous people, what have you seen?
Well, I think sovereignty, be it indigenous or otherwise, is all about landscape. It's all about territory, and there's no, the measure of people is their spirit of place, and their destiny as determined by where they choose to live out that destiny.
Mm.
When we get into the issue of the prominent psychoactive substances, the sacred medicines, it gets a little bit more complicated because the medicines are used by many people. So, for example, in the case of peyote, we pretty much understand that it originated with the Tarahumara, then it moved to the Huichol, and it only really reached the American plains through Quanah Parker, who was Comanche, who had a vision. And it really arrived on the American plains in the wake of the collapse of indigenous life, in the wake of the disappearance of the buffalo, the slaughter of the buffalo, which was a deliberate act of biological terrorism. And it spread at an extraordinary rate of diffusion of basically a society or a culture a year for 100 years, reaching as far north as Jasmine's people, the Cree. And it was kind of what it became was almost a pharmacological shortcut to distant metaphysical realms that traditionally on the plains had been reached by other means of elevating the spirit, other techniques of ecstasy, the ordeal, the vision quest, the ingestion of these mescal beans, which are more toxin than hallucinogen, if you will. And so these plants move around and they're embraced. So it's very tricky if we start to assign ownership to any one culture, particularly in terms of these substances which are embraced by so many cultures, ayahuasca, mushrooms, and of course peyote. And I think most of the practitioners that I know have a very strong sense that these are universal sacraments that ought to be accessible to all people. It becomes very, very different when more dominant forces begin to try to appropriate these substances, as in the case of those who, in this inconceivably misguided and egregious manner, attempted to try to patent ayahuasca, which is just a hideous thing to contemplate. But I think in general, these medicines, and it gets tricky, like for example, I've got friends who've been involved in serious efforts at drug discovery using ethnobotany as a vehicle or the lens. And they've tried with very intense efforts to answer the question of compensation. And it's not easy. If, for example, you come upon a plant and work collaboratively with an indigenous group that turns out to be beneficial, what happens if you worked with other groups that didn't yield a plant for your research? What happens if there are other communities of that same culture that also have that plant, but you didn't happen to work with them? Or do you compensate the individual, the community? Do you compensate the entire region? It's not easy because money can be as poisonous as it can be beneficial. And so the whole idea of compensation becomes complex. It becomes particularly complex when you get a situation where the potential of indigenous plant knowledge is kind of exploited by conservationists as a kind of rationale for conservation, and it creates this kind of house of cards where there's this almost a fantasy of biopiracy and intellectual property theft, as if people somewhere are making millions of dollars from these plant medicines, and it's just not actually happening. So it's a very complicated issue, a balance of respect, practicality, politics, and justice.
Thank you. It's as you're talking about it, I'm thinking of different places. I've had the privilege of being in the Tarahumara country, and and understanding where they do their migration for their month-long to harvest their what do you call it? What's the word? I can't think of the word.
You're thinking of, I think, the Huichol
The Huichol, yeah, the Huichol, and
Ikuli,
it
the
could,
tracks of the
and
sacred deer.
yeah, and they go for a month and those fields are being, ravaged by other, by other
Well,
people.
a very
Mhm.
big problem has been the exploitation of peyote.
Yeah,
Peyote doesn't have a
totally.
huge range. It's not that vast a
No.
range, and it's been hit very hard to the extent that the Huichol,
Yeah,
have lost access in some cases, and
yeah,
the Tarahumara. The Tarahumara are really the ones who gifted peyote to the world, I think.
yeah, yeah. I've met some amazing people from down in that part of the world. Thank you. Jasmine, um, plants and how they're used are kind of a perfect conduit for understanding culture. Have there been many plant medicines that you've seen lost? Do you think that there are many plants that have been lost to colonization in your territory?
Yeah. I found that due to colonization, a lot of the plants fell out of use rather. That they didn't have a necessary psychoactive effect like ayahuasca or peyote would. So they fell behind because Western medicine had begun to dominate the culture, and it's absolutely necessary where we are. But however, when I think about plant medicine, because I've worked with ayahuasca for the last 8 years now, which isn't very long when it comes to ayahuasca time. Uh, but when I've worked with that medicine, it's, as Wade had stated, I feel like it's a medicine for everyone. So why wouldn't it have tracked itself at the way that tobacco did to Canada? We still use what's considered the psychoactive Nicotiana rustica as a healing modality. We pass tobacco when we ask questions, when we want to gather knowledge, when we want to gift to our plant medicines. So I like to think of the medicine of the world, that it's right, we all should have access to many of these medicines, because even though in my area we wouldn't necessarily use the mosquito, the Amanita muscaria from our area, because of the frightfulness with its use, because of the ibotenic acid, and people frivolously using that medicine without any knowledge. So it's few and far between what I see in my specific region to be using many of these psychoactive plants. However, many Indigenous people, because we, like in my area especially, we have gone through a lot of trauma ourselves and personally, and still are being traumatized. So the use of ayahuasca has been such a powerful gift for so many people here. I want to share the knowledge with everyone, because of how it's able to help to recover many of the post-traumatic stresses. And in my city in particular, there are a lot of people suffering that could really use medicine from our brothers in Peru. And that's why I mentioned Maestro Juan Flores in my biography, is because he said he would help, and he said he could help, and he has been. And so he's taught me his way of dieting, the dietas in South America. And they've, a number of Indigenous peoples where I am, we've gone through a number of these dietas with the plants locally. And Maestro Juan Flores says, don't worry about the dieta, don't eat the South American stuff, eat your traditional food. And then you can connect better to your land. And that's how we're connecting back to our identities. So using medicines from elsewhere, be it peyote, be it wachuma, they've brought my identity back, and they've brought other people's identities back. I hope this answers the questions well, Kim.
Yeah, it does, because it brings up, I mean, the next question sort of was going to go back to Wade, but the whole thing about reciprocity, about, how much it's tricky when plant medicines are coming. There's a whole sort of politics around it, right? Who's getting the plant medicines? How are the plant medicines moving? You know, I could, I'm not going to talk on that, but what that entails. And yet we know that these plant medicines have an intelligence and have an ability to heal. Maybe, Wade, I think the question would change then about maybe other continents that you've been to and plant medicines there in that same sort of perspective.
I think, Kim, it's important to remember that, you know, the desire to invoke some technique of ecstasy to transform the consciousness, at least momentarily, is so ubiquitous in the human record that it has to be seen as part of a basic human appetite, and how you satisfy that appetite depends on the cultural orientation, the adaptive imperative, the place that you live. And one of the really extraordinary anomalies of botanical science is that of the roughly 120 identified entheogens, of which probably there are 20 really dominant ones, 95% of those are from the Americas. And not because the forests of equatorial Africa or Southeast Asia were depauperate. And certainly Nigeria, for example, has yielded iboga or ibogaine, which is an exception to what I'm saying. And there are probably some psychoactive substances we have not really chronicled in Southwest Africa as well, amongst the Koshi. But the interesting thing is, it's not as if the people in those regions haven't studied their flora. On the contrary, in Africa, for example, the manipulation of toxic plants is probably the most ubiquitous trait of material culture. Whereas in the Amazon, they had poisons, curaris, but they generally weren't used on each other. And similarly, in other parts of the world, people have not discovered psychoactive substances that we know of, not because they don't exist in the flora, for example, but because simply the other people have other avenues to the divine. Kim, you were mentioning the time that you spent in Haiti, where I did a lot of work. And the Haitians were always saying to me, you white people go to church and speak about God. The Arawako used to eat plants and speak to God, and we dance in the temple and become God. And what you find is that in the African reality, the vehicle to the divine is spirit possession. And that in fact in Haiti, although there is now, of course, illicit cocaine and cannabis used to some extent, but there's never been a traditional entheogenic plant in African culture, with the noted exception of iboga. And that's not because the people didn't assay their flora. They did, but they found other avenues to the divine. So I think that's important to. And one of the reasons that in the Americas these substances, I think, were focused upon is that many cultures in the Americas were based on shamanism, right? And the shaman is the antithesis of a priest. The role of the shaman is to catalyze the individual's wild genius. The shaman can be a physician, he can be priest in a sense, but for example, the shaman of peoples like the Barasana, the Makuna, the Tanimucos, the Tucanos of the Northwest Amazon never even touch or would even think of using medicinal plants. They are much more analogous to a nuclear engineer who periodically goes to the heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. That is how ayahuasca is used. Ayahuasca in the Northwest Amazon, where it originated, is almost never used in the spirit in which it's used by the current gringo tourism, or even by the folkloric use of it in syncretic ceremonies in places like Mocoa on the road to the Putumayo. The idea that I go to solve my problems to a shaman who will give me ayahuasca, that's not how it's used. It's always used in a completely collective sense, so that the use of it becomes a prayer for the survival of the entire community. I mean, for example, with the Barasana, I once spent a ceremony for a cassava woman, a fertility rite that went on for 3 days and 3 nights, in which the the men don't become symbols of the ancestors, they become the ancestors, and they literally soar away on the wings of trance to get to the points of mythical resonance, where they can track the path of the ancestors and reaffirm their sense of obligation, and maintain the energetic flows of the world. I mean, the most profound cultural insight of the Bharasana is the realization that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. But these ceremonies are very much communal. They're not individual in any sense. And so I think that, again, the use of these plants is firmly rooted in culture.
How do you think the movement on your land, or let's say that I'm going to go into the Jacotan Declaration, but can hold the idea of sovereignty mixed with what you're learning?
Yeah, my journey has been propelled by plant medicines that aren't necessarily from our nation. These technologies, as Wade was saying, all of these different technologies that were used to go to places, to communicate, to literally go to places, whether it was Vision Quest, whether it was, going in the ice, in the water, all of these different modalities. And what we're seeing in our nation, where this new ceremony is being embraced with medicines from other regions and using the foundations of our traditions and these new medicines, there's this beautiful new coming together of a people, our people, and who are going into ceremony where there's just something new is being created in our Indigenous community, which is beautiful. And it's founded upon the mutual respect of the power of these medicines. And when the medicines are moved in the right way, when they're respected, there is, the bureaucracy and paperwork kind of becomes nullified, of like, okay, where's the signature? Where does this come from? It's, oh no, these are medicines. This can help us. It's kind of like, we know this, and this is just a different way to get there. And we respect the people from where this comes from, because we're also Ninkaini in our language. Ninkaini is people of the land. And so, okay, oh, this comes from Ninkaini, other people from the land. Whoa, we need to learn from them. What does their land look like? What are their stories like? What are their songs like? And so with, I think, this weaving of the old and the new, and the north and the south, and these new ceremonies together, new realizations, new visions can be made with Indigenous communities in regards to land sovereignty, in regards to politics, in regards to what it means to protect and manage land. Because you talked about the Nimai Declaration, which was signed in 1989, which is about 245,000 hectares around Choco Lake, Talioko Lake, and Tasiko Lake. So these are one of the three largest glacial lakes in our territory. And so that was a declaration and an acknowledgement of every water that flows into these lakes that's there for us to steward and manage. It's the direction of the water, because when the water hits the lakes, like, that's where we're named after. And so in regards to my journey is I come from the survivor of residential schools. 5 of my aunties, 6 of my uncles, all kidnapped by a collusion between the church and the government. And so my journey involved plant medicines, and where that found me was, we have a program called Back Out on the Land. And so through the ceremonies and through the exploration that I've gotten to have with these medicines out on our territory, where it's, just as Wade was saying, these medicines, they weren't necessarily used for, this is for me and my problems, and I got to deal with this. It's communal. And for me, in that learning process, being able to, experience these experiences at the bottom of the glaciers, at where the streams meet the lake, and getting the download of information, which can lead to other programs that can work towards uh, bringing together our nation, because right now there's a lot of identity kind of found in the status cards, in the 71200343302. That's who I am to the federal government, and in our communities, in our learning journey, that's who we see each other as.
Right.
Oh, you're from this community, I'm from this community. But these plant medicines are getting back to the perception of identity of through water,
Yes.
and how that can connect
Yes.
the nation. So
Beautiful.
yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's something I've seen, is how the medicines coming here are helping people get in touch with their own culture and their land in different ways, where I've seen the ceremonies go to Indigenous communities, really important. I think there was something out of, Wade, I'm going to come back to you, just because I'm interested in what you've seen in the effects of colonization. I've spent time in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I've also spent time in sort of that latitude, and saw a lot of the similar plant medicines that I learned about, like throughout the Caribbean. I saw plant medicines that haven't been in use because of, the interruption, I imagine, from the Tiano people and whatever practices they had. And so I wonder, you said that there are similar plants in Africa, right? Or not?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a lot there. The flora is very, very different. I just like to say that this idea of Indigenous people absorbing and using sacred medicines from elsewhere is a perfectly wonderful thing. I really oppose this notion of preservation of culture. You preserve jam, you don't preserve culture. All peoples everywhere are always dancing with new possibilities for life. And it makes perfect sense that these medicines
Mhm.
are used to heal trauma, but don't forget they were used to heal trauma for all of us. I've always said
Right.
that, I sometimes, Kim, and I do so much public speaking, I can be at the podium and giving my rap and watching myself give the rap, and then having my mind elsewhere. And I sometimes hear myself saying things and I think, well, how the hell did that little
Mhm.
boy from that suburb of Montreal grow up to have those ideas? Well,
Mhm.
it's interesting. If we look back on my lifetime, I'm older than the three of you. In my lifetime, miracles have happened. Women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to
Mhm.
the altar. When I was a kid,
Mhm.
just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. Nobody spoke of Gaia or the biosphere. No, now those are terms familiar to
Mhm.
school children. And yet, when we look back at the recipe of social change in my lifetime, the one ingredient that we expunge from the record often is that millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken a psychedelic. And when,
Mhm.
I not only took psychedelics, I wouldn't write the way I write, I wouldn't think the way I think, I wouldn't have understood cultural relativism, I wouldn't have appreciated the wonder of culture. I wouldn't have this fundamental idea that has motivated my entire life, the simple notion that every culture has something to say, each deserves to be heard, and just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. I mean, I wouldn't be who I am if I hadn't taken psychedelics. I'm old enough to remember the era when our parents were absolutely terrified that we take these substances, and they'd say to us, "Don't take these things, you'll never come back the same." Well, of course, that was the whole bloody point.
Yay.
That was the whole bloody point.
Right?
Take the psychedelic to break out of the straitjacket of that kind of
Mhm.
bourgeois world that we saw to be problematic in terms of the treatment of women, the treatment of gay people, the
Yeah.
treatment of people of color, an endless war in Vietnam. We wanted to break open the sky, and psychedelics
Mhm.
allowed us to do that. And so, to my sense, back to the issue of colonialism, remember that
Mhm.
the essence of colonialism is to persuade the colonized of their own inherent inferiority. And I
Yep.
remember when I was in the Northwest Amazon, we made this film with the Barasana in total collaboration.
Mhm.
And in the middle of it, a friend of mine, an anthropologist from Cambridge, who had lived with the Barasana and was the only outsider to speak the language. And he had predicted in 1968 the imminent demise of the community. It just felt like a place of cultural exhaustion. And then he flew in to join us, and he hadn't been in the forest for some years. And he walked into this maloka, this longhouse, and suddenly saw 250 men and women in full ritual regalia in this incredible salutation for cassava women. And having predicted the disappearance of the culture, he got on the satellite phone to his wife and back in London and said, Christina, you will not believe my eyes. The only thing that disappeared are the fucking missionaries. And the point is, we then asked some of the elders, why did you put up with these missionaries for so long? Because even when I was there in the 70s, you could feel that it was totally dominated by their presence. And these elders said to us something I'll never forget, very poignant. He said, because they promised to make us human. And that is the essence of colonization, is to persuade the colonized of their inferiority. And so this Renaissance and these medicines are all part of a bigger story. And, one of the things that happened is that, the shaman was always a cultural pivot. The curandero, the maestro, the brujo, the healer was a cultural pivot. And everywhere missionaries went, that was the first institution of culture that was undercut.
Amazing. Thank you. Those are, yeah. Jasmine, can you tell us about your work that you're doing right now in land-based resurgence?
Yeah, I work using the plant medicine and Western, like contemporary methods to integrate with this idea called health transformation that was created into policy by Anishinaabe Aski Nation in the region that I'm in Northern Ontario. And much of that work, it isn't just my integration of these plant medicines into the regular regime, but it's to make it okay in the mind, because like Wade said, I wouldn't be sitting here with you guys unless I took psychedelics. Like, that is opened my heart and opened my mind enough to be able to see that this idea of health transformation is absolutely possible, because unfortunately we can't take the road backward, but we can go forward. So we can go forward with and I think it's called cultural diffusion, where we're blending and we're creating and we're making new, like Trevor said, but like these are new ceremonies and these are new ways of being, and I don't know the necessary outcome of any of that, but I just pray that many of the elders who choose to use their medicine would be able to use them freely, because it's very difficult where I am for people to be okay with using just regular plant medicine. Like that's like a not okay thing. And so I work specifically with, the chronic illness in many Indigenous communities, diabetes, because it's an epidemic, and it's been like that for the last 20, 30 years, terribly. And you can see a lot of these effects on the children. And the great thing about what I've done is I've brought the children to the land, or I was invited into a number of communities to bring children out on the land and to show them, how to feel the plants again, because it's kind of like we lost this sense of feeling. And because I've had psychedelics, they don't need to have them. I can show them what I've learned. And so that's what I've been doing, is showing, tasting, and using all of our senses to be able to experience the world in a new way. And many of the kids are just happy and shocked, and they do change their lives. We have a suicide crisis, like terribly. And there's this one program I work with, it's called the Choose Life program, and it's where we preserve many of these traditions. But when I'm looking at it, from an anthropological perspective, is that it's diffusion. It's like we're mixing a lot of what we're doing. We're not using our traditional, especially the young people, not using traditional language, but all the elders, they speak they speak their language, and the language houses many of the teachings in them. Like when we say strawberry, it means heartberry in Ojibwe, or in Anishinaabe and Inimoan. Like it means, and so that's what we use that medicine for. And so there's a lot of teachings that, you know, the only thing I deeply encourage is that everybody uses their language so that
Right.
we can integrate these plant medicines into our daily life, because that's what our parents and our elders did already. So very and especially in my region, we use a lot of rat root, and rat root is a bog plant that is very, very potent, very pungent. And you know what, Schultes would say that it was psychedelic, but I hate to tell you, it's not. you could eat 10 inches of it.
He said everything was psychedelic.
Well, but he's right though. But he was right, because everything has, you know, everything is a poison and everything is a medicine. So it just depends on dosage. That's what I'm finding.
Well, you know, that's Jasmine, that's Schultes. Before I went to the Amazon when I was 20, he said, always remember that the difference between a narcotic, a hallucinogen, a medicine, and a poison is just dosage.
Yeah, and you know what, I didn't read that from Schultes, but we know that when we work with all the plants, right? Like we spend so much time with them, we're like, ooh, you better wash your hands, or you better not drink too much of that, or but yeah, it was the calamus root. He said that it was very like the calamus root that we have in the region where he studied, the Northern Cree in Manitoba, was psychedelic if you had 10 inches, or even Jonathan Ott, I think, said that. And I had a conversation with Jonathan Ott, and I said, no, you don't get high off that. You just get your butt burns. Like you just get a very hot belly. And it's funny. It's funny to me because I could hear the elder telling whoever took this information, the ethnobotanist, that, oh yeah, eat 10 inches of that. They're kind of just teasing, right? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just like, I worked with somebody with a calamus root who powdered it and handed it out that way and just said, here, try this. And I'm like, wait a second, isn't that poisonous? And he's like, just try it. But in regards to what it flushed out, and it was in that moment very, psychedelic. I have to say that, right?
Yes. If you use it as a rapé, like they do in South America, the hape, your nose will not stop running, but you do not have any infections in your face or anywhere in your sinuses.
It has a thing. Something that you said that actually ties into Wade, some of an old story, and I think Trevor, you'll understand this. Is there's a man, Northern Haida man who recently passed over, Woody Morrison, who said, we come from the land, and our ceremonies, everything comes from the land to show us, and the language is part of that, which is really important. And that place of knowing, because we listen and submit to the sacred, whatever that is, whether the intelligence of the universe. And I remember, Wade, a long time ago, I think it was the Panan you talked about in regards to asking them how they know which plants go together, and it was the plants that sing. Maybe it was the Mento. I don't remember where that story.
Kim, that's the story of Schultes, actually, from the Siona Sequoia in the Oriente of Ecuador. It's because they had 17 different varieties of the actual Liana of Banisteriopsis capi, that all of which were referable to his Harvard-trained taxonomic eye as being the same, and yet they distinguished them, he said, consistently and at some distances in the forest. And when he asked them the nature of their classification, they said, well, you take each one on the night of a moon, and each one sings to you in a different key.
Which is really beautiful. I remember that was a long time ago, 26 years ago, when I first heard that story, so I didn't remember it, but it made me think of, I was working with some people from a gentleman, Jose Luis, from the Orinoco Basin, and he was showing me how to make yopo. And he was stirring, and I asked him, how do you know? How do you know? And he laughed and he said, because can't you hear all of this music? And I remember hearing him say that and being like, what the heck? What are people talking about? So Jasmine, when you speak about that place of that connection, or Trevor, when you speak about that place in regards to, I know that you go spend it in the culture. You guys spend time up at the headwaters, right, where the glaciers come in, and in those places, which I think is really, really, really beautiful. As we're looking at this Renaissance time of psychedelics, um, do you think that there's a future for culturally sanctioned use of these plants in the West? And how should that play out in terms of respecting and honoring Indigenous sovereignty? Because I know, Wade, you kind of mentioned it, and I remember, and I don't remember where it was, where the Indigenous people shared their knowledge with somebody, and then it became patented, and I don't remember that. It was somewhere in the Americas, in South America, but it became an issue when you sort of looking at corporate.
Yeah, there've been a number of attempts, Kim, that I think have been sort of laughed off the map, frankly, where entities made attempts to try to patent ayahuasca preparations, for example, but I don't think they ever went. I mean, it provoked such an backlash, such an outrage, that I think it didn't go anywhere that I know of.
Okay, good. So how do you think, for Trevor, maybe, I think you maybe touched on that, but just bringing those medicines to here, and also being careful around access to medicines. And, it's a big conversation that I know that you've had with your teacher. I don't know if you can give a reflection on what that means and who has access, and how that rolls out in our communities.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So I think the role psychedelics are going to be playing in the West, I think, has the potential to be the greatest cultural exchange that our world has ever seen, and I think that can happen if we prioritize healing Indigenous communities first. If that is the sole priority, where all of this energy is going, healing Indigenous communities, these communities and these nations and these societies who have these spatial identities, these spatial relationships to the world, to the cosmos. And I think when looking at Indigenous populations as one of the fastest growing populations in Canada, where you have in just a few years, you're going to have people who are going to be making political decisions within these communities. And these societies already have songs, already have dances, already have ceremonies there as a foundation to be able to have an easier segue for these medicines to be used without the without a situation as Wade was talking about, where you have patenting or overt commercialization of these experiences, of these medicines. And so I think if we prioritize healing Indigenous communities with and introducing them in ways where there are already initiation ceremonies, there are already ceremonies in ways that with these medicines it can be normalized in a way where decision making, where songs, dances can be weaved into a new ceremony, where instead of the INAC systems, instead of the making decisions in the band office under the fluorescent lights and in the boardrooms without a fire in the middle, we can create a future where, because of these healings with these medicines, that there's a whole new generation of Indigenous youth growing up thinking, why wouldn't we be making decisions without these medicines? Why wouldn't we be making decisions without a fire in the middle and being out on the land? And so I think being able to focus on that, there's an opportunity then, if we have nation to nation relationships with Indigenous nations and colonial governments.
Beautiful.
Perhaps there's a way where we can say, hey, you can't do anything with us unless you take these medicines, unless you have ceremony with us. You can't, there's no contracts, there's no fishing and land rights negotiations unless we're in ceremony,
brother,
in this place. And so, and I think if we put energy into that way, and with the shared reciprocity of these medicines between Ninkaini, I think there can be something there.
I think that's a really good wish. I just have to say that. And I would love that to happen because that could be very revolutionary. Jasmine, and then I'm going to be any last thoughts, and we're going to come to a close and wait.
I wholeheartedly appreciate everything that Trevor has said. If we all could take these medicines, and if it was a nation to nation agreements, like they were established many years ago, I think today we have a better opportunity. We have a greater opportunity for a lot of this, because it's not just me that needs to heal, or my community that needs to heal. It's everyone else out there too. So I'm just having compassion for that thing that's inside of everyone, that I don't know, I guess I refer to it as the heart. It's like everybody has some heart, and if we can connect right back to that heart, maybe the people that maybe the people could hear the songs that I hear in the trees, or the songs that I hear from the plants. Maybe we could have a commonality between all of us. And I think that everyone has that potential to be able to have that. Although I come from a different worldview, so my worldview has a specific inviting quality of being able to hear songs in the trees and songs in the muskegs, and realizing that the muskeg is going to eat me whole, or like I have a particular perspective that I just can't get away from. My professors tried. I went to a really hard STEM school for my master's, and and we bumped a lot of heads that way. But I think if we all could connect with our hearts with the psychedelic medicines, or or whatever option, maybe we could help to each other to heal. And then one day we may not need to use medicines in that way. I just think that we could step in for more. We could get more, so we could just sit in the trees and hear the songs, and not necessarily have to imbibe in anything at that time, because I do spend time myself just doing that on my own. So
Beautiful.
I hope I have a lot of hope.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Wade.
Well, I think it's important to remember that these magical substances have a kind of ambivalent potential for good or evil. They kind of create a template upon which other forces go to work, and that's why from the very beginning of when these substances came to the attention of the scientific world, people were using the term set and setting. It's just so important, both the mental set you bring the experience and the physical setting in which they are done. I mean, one of the things we've learned is in the Western society, which remains tormented by a drug problem that just gets worse by the day. Why is it these indigenous cultures have managed to use their substances for thousands of years without having any challenges? And some basic answers are they use these substances in natural forms, which are pharmacologically the safest. Secondly, they insulate. They recognize that the use of these substances is a positive and legitimate thing to do within the society. And then critically, they insulate the user from the rather stunning pharmacological effects with a protective cloak of ritual. And I think that's a model for the use of these substances in both therapy and in spiritual questing, if you will. But I think, when we talk about healing, particularly with the psychedelic renaissance, we're looking at post-traumatic stress. I can absolutely see ecstasy serving couples therapy. I can see tryptamines being useful for palliative care and hospice care and end-of-death experiences. But there's a form of healing that we often don't talk about that Jasmine referred to, and that's healing our relationship with the earth. And to me, for example, my favorite of all of these entheogenic plants has always been washumo, the cactus of four winds, which is a mescaline-based columnar cactus native to the Andes of Peru. And certainly, I can't imagine taking that plant, San Pedro, without having a deeper appreciation of the wonder of nature. And again, when I think of the biggest gift that I've received from these plants over the years, and I'm 67, and so I'm very much of the generation, that had, a divide. Timothy Leary kept taking these substances, John Lennon did, but people like Richard Albert and others and George Harrison, got the phone call, lifted up, got the message and hung up. I don't think you necessarily have to use these substances all of your life. I mean, I think I think there are different phases when they can be helpful. I think if you're young and you're trying to deconstruct your life and the bourgeois world or the imposed colonial world that's been, they can be really liberating. But then there comes a time that, you're trying to, the householder phase, as they say in the Vedic scriptures, you're trying to get that family together. You're trying to get that living together. And maybe it's a time when you don't need, having constructed your own world, to have that world shattered apart by these substances. But then maybe when you become an old guy like me, again, following that Vedic notion of leaving the householder phase and entering the phase of the sadhu, anticipating one's own demise, one's own death, maybe that's a time when we experiment once again. But the important point is that you cannot take something like San Pedro and not come away with a deeper appreciation of the beauty and wonder of the natural world and your place in it. To me, when we talk of healing, in terms for the global population, certainly for the Western population, I think that's the biggest gift these plants can give to us, realigning our sense with the natural world. Remember, it's really important to remember that the Western European idea about nature didn't just come from nowhere. It came from a specific moment in time when we tried to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith. When Descartes said that all that existed is mind and matter, in a single phrase, he de-animated the world. The idea that the flight of a bird could have meaning was ridiculed, right? Science made a house cleaning of belief. A mountain was only a pile of rock, a forest cellulose and board feet. And we began to view the world as a stage set upon which only the human drama unfolded. Plants and animals were just props in our theater piece. The world was de-animated. And therefore, our relationship shifted into a purely extractive modality, which was not the norm. We think of it the norm because it's ubiquitous and powerful. It's highly exceptional. Most cultures around the world view the world through a reciprocal lens, a simple iteration of the fundamental idea that the earth owes its bounty to people, people owe their fidelity to the earth. And what we lost in the Western way of thinking was the power of metaphor. What do I mean by that? I was raised to believe a mountain was a pile of rock ready to be mined. I was raised to believe a forest existed to be cut. That made me very different than my godchildren in the mountains of Peru, raised to believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct their destiny, or my friends amongst the Kwakwaka'wakw who believe that the forest is the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven. Now, the interesting thing is not who's right and who's wrong. Who cares? Who's to say? The interesting thing is how the belief itself mediates the human relationship to the land with profoundly different ecological consequences. If I believe that a mountain is a deity, I will have a different relationship to it, a reverence for it that I will not have if I'm told it's simply a pile of rock. And the same thing goes with the forest. And so we have to get back into this metaphorical, blissful embrace of our place, not apart from nature, as elements of nature. And that's why it's so important when we have societies like the Kogi and the Arawako, the sun priests of the Arawako, still of the ancient Tairona civilization, still alive today, looking down at the very beaches where Columbus's men landed on the third voyage and telling us that their prayers literally maintain the cosmic balance of the world. Or when the Bharasana say that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. When we look at their mythology and realize it's a land management plan dictating how people could live in that forest. This is why we have to maintain this sort of ongoing universal dialogue, again, driven by the idea that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being us. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when they answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity.
I'm really excited to see the future of these medicines and how and how and these new ceremonies are emerging, just as there are new ceremonies in our territory emerging with shared medicines, and to see where that's going to lead to, with I see a future where there's psychedelic therapists learning from uh, plant medicine healers, and building these beautiful traditional ceremonial places all throughout Canada, with the foundations of the songs and the dances and the ceremonies that are already here, just as Wade was beautifully describing all of these different philosophies of the mountains alive, in our language, the Zach in our language, the mountains, and their spirits, they're alive, they control the weather. And we go up to them and we give offerings to them, because we know that we give to them because they're able to take it. They're more wise, and they're more alive, and they're able to take care of us. And so when I think we empower these communities, when we empower Indigenous communities, who right now are in need of a lot of healing, I think this beautiful flower will blossom that will naturally have reciprocity between non-Indigenous and Indigenous cultures. And I think right now, perhaps it's the West, perhaps it's their time to start listening. Just as in my journey, I had to listen. I had my jaw wired shut for 3 months after I was mugged and assaulted in downtown Vancouver. In my journey, the ancestors were whispering, and I wasn't listening. And then they said, "Okay, this guy's got to start listening now." And so I had my jaw wired shut for 3 months, and then I began to learn how to listen. And so maybe it's time for the West to learn how to listen, to these songs that Indigenous peoples in Canada have been singing in defiance of an entire force trying to genocide us, trying to assimilate us, and trying to make us disappear. Songs have been defying and have been ringing throughout the mountains, ringing over the plateaus and across the waters. And I think I'm just really excited to see a future where those songs are sung together while elevating the Indigenous voices throughout Canada.
Wow. I don't know how I could top that, Trevor. Like, I don't know how, like, you're just so thoughtful and sweet, and your heart's so big, and I'm so happy to be sitting here with you and everyone. Because I feel you. Okay. Yeah, so what I hope for in the future, no, what I hope for right now in my heart and all of the hearts, um, and it doesn't matter who you are, is that you could experience that sense of relief, and you could experience that same feeling that I get when I'm on my water, that same sense of deep connection. Because I think in my life I went through a lot of trauma, and systemic trauma that came from intergenerationally. And what's great about the psychedelics is that it stops with me. It stops here, and I get to open myself enough where hopefully those that I'm around would actually follow that warmness, because we've all made mistakes and we've all done really awesome things, but many of these psychedelics have brought this sense of healing back to the heart. And my work with the plants, that's how I was able to hear a lot of the teachings from the plants themselves, was through the use of psychedelics in general. Like that's how the education works, is you ingest, you work in all the portions of the plant, root to tip, root to seed essentially, and they all have different things to teach us. So using all of those methods and just taking a little bit of time, even if you learned one tiny little thing about a plant that could help others. So I've in my area, I frequently teach how red willow can, like dogwood, can, prevent diarrhea if you're suffering. Or you can use it the opposite way, where you soak it and it's a purgative. So just learning one little thing can open you up enough to be able to see. And I thank Maestro Juan Flores for teaching me that, because I was just as closed as many other Indigenous people in my area that suffer. So hopefully that's I can put a lot of praise out there for everyone taking us little by little to a place of recovery and healing, where one day it would just, we'll all feel great together. And maybe it's a pipe dream, but I still pray. My heart still prays for it.
I think it's really important, because when we're looking at climate change, when we're looking at leadership, when we're looking at people with eating the mochuma, which I absolutely love, of connecting us into that place which is bigger than us. I mean, maybe we should give some to Elon Musk or those people like that, the billionaires, for a consciousness shift. The other piece is is understanding that relationship, Jasmine, as you said, with your land, and how you're part of that, part of that cycle, as Wade, as you bring it around, all the way around. We understand that it is very limited in regard to that place which is separated from sort of the sacred. And I think that's it. I prefer myth over science any day. I love the stories where I travel around and hear and make meaning, and how I view the world is so different. That's one of the blessings of the medicines. Thank you. What a wonderful, important discussion. This wraps our panel today on the topic of Indigenous sovereignty in plant medicine as part of the World Psychedelic Day. Thank you so much to the speakers who have taken their time out of their schedules to take a look at these important topics in the psychedelic sphere. Thank you to all the sponsors for World Psychedelic Day and everyone that has contributed to making this happen. Happy World Psychedelic Day. Thank you so much. I mean, Wade, we could listen to you forever. You're kind of a walking book, and really beautiful to hear young voices coming up in this, as future leaders coming into this work and taking the reign. And so wonderful to meet all of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks to Jasmine and Trevor. It's been lovely to be with you.
Yeah, thanks, Wade and Trevor. Amazing. And Kim, wow.
Nako sa channel ya Gudlin. Nanano sin, my language means we'll see you again.